All right, the Building Operators Association has, since September, had our meetings being virtual. We are not allowed to meet in because of this pandemic. And so we have had on each of our meetings a guest speaker. And the topic we have been focusing on has been the coronavirus. It seems to be prevalent in our industry, and we want to make sure that what we present to you is focused on education and giving the best that we possibly can. Since we've entered out into this lockdown, and because of the coronavirus, we've all heard a lot of information with regards to it. With some of that information has been good information, and some of it has been misinformation. So it's pretty hard to sometimes separate the good from the bad. So the Building Operators Association, in these education virtual meetings and webinars, have tried to distill it down to the stuff that's most important and the stuff that we believe that is true. These rumors and speculation and misinformation is prevalent. So that we've tried to present these fact-based information using sources such as ASHRAE, in Health Canada, and BOMA to present what we believe to be the best possible information. We want to hear from our guest speakers, and so the one that we have brought for you today is Curt LaMontagne from C5+. Curt has been involved in indoor air quality since 1908. He's consulted both in Canada as well as in the USA, and his focus has been high-rise office towers looking at indoor environmental quality management. Curt is currently working in Calgary, his company C5+, and he has excelled in software development, focused on commercial environment, and Curt is a valued member of the BOMA Best team here in Calgary. Curt holds an honors degree in philosophy at the University of Calgary and is a graduate of strategic management from the University of California out of San Diego. So today, Curt will be focusing on well-established, credible sources, such as principles set forward and supported by organizations such as ASHRAE, Health Canada, and BOMA. So BOA Calgary, this webinar series for January is pleased to present Curt LaMontagne of C5+. Thank you, Curt.
And thank you, Les. You pretty much covered it. I don't have much left to say now.
Wow, gosh.
Anyhow, as Les was just saying, and I want to emphasize this, the reason for this particular webinar is because we're seeing just an immense amount of information out there with respect to IAQ during the pandemic. And a lot of it's pretty questionable at best, but even a lot of the good information is just getting overwhelming. It's coming from multiple sources and slightly different interpretations. And so the message I'm trying to get across with this is let's just calm down and get back to the basics. So I'm not going to go into a deep technical dive on this, but I'm going to focus on things that you guys as building operations professionals probably already understand and should be completely focused on, just to make sure everything's happening as it should be. And then we can look at some of the other stuff. So what I'm going to talk about very quickly, I'm going to do a quick recap of IAQ and COVID-19, how they relate, talk a bit about the legal and other risks, which is a little hair-raising, talk about credible sources, a little bit about innovation and, you know, what's silver bullets and what's snake oil, and the answer is no silver bullets and lots of snake oil, and then hopefully a good Q&A discussion. So just because of who I am and the way I tend to do these things, I always like to reward people for coming to these things on their own time by giving a quick snap quiz. Don't worry, you don't actually have to answer these questions, but ASHRAE 62.1 2019, which is the ventilation standard, what is the recommended level of CO2 in office spaces in that version? Dun, 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 dun. There is no such recommendation, and there never has been. And this is a myth that's floating around, but it's important to realize that ASHRAE 62.1 talks about ventilation rates, not CO2 levels. They have, up until 2019, given a reference how you can use CO2 levels to derive ventilation rates if you do it properly. My suspicion is, by the way, they stopped even doing that in 2019 because nobody ever does it properly. Next step, what's the recommended level of ventilation then, if that's what they're talking about in office spaces for dealing with airborne contaminants? You should also know these are always trick questions. They don't. It's not based on anything except odor control. You know that reading the 2019 version, but if you look at the historical versions, especially even as recently as 2016 and 2013, they explicitly state in the standard that it's a minimum amount of ventilation to keep odors under control. And the test for that, by the way, is that only 1 person out of 5 coming into your office space is offended by the smells in the first 15 seconds. Let that sink in for a second. The ventilation standard in a high-rise office tower in downtown Calgary, according to ASHRAE, says 1 out of 5 people can be offended by the odors in the space when they walk in. That's probably not what you want to be doing during a pandemic. And it's also worth pointing out that ASHRAE specifically states that this standard does not take into account other contaminants such as radon, such as fungi, such as viruses. So again, if anybody's telling you to meet the ASHRAE standard during a pandemic, they don't understand what ASHRAE is trying to solve with this. Now, ASHRAE does have a pandemic response, which is quite a bit different and makes a lot more sense. So there's an old saw about if you're going to do a class, you're going to teach something or have a seminar, what you do is you tell people what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. So I thought I'd just cut out the middleman and tell you, this is what I'm asking you to remember. This is what I'm trying to tell you during this webinar. And that is, here's 3 things as building operations you should be focused on to keep your buildings very healthy during a pandemic, this particular pandemic. And in order, you want to supply as much fresh air as you possibly can within the limitations, of course, of your building systems. You want to filter that air as much as you can, hopefully MERV 13 or better, as long as you don't actually impact the supply of fresh air. And then the third one, which isn't as important, but is still important, is try to keep the humidity between 40 and 60%, as close up to 60 as you can get it. And again, be aware in Calgary or Edmonton, Alberta in the winter, the odds of being able to do that are pretty close to 0. Don't damage your buildings based on best practice standards. You do the best you can within the context of what your building systems can handle. So let's talk very quickly about the definition of what IAQ is. This is important. Definition: airborne contaminants affecting the health or comfort of building occupants. And that comes in, either it comes in from outside, it comes from the building materials in your building, off-gassing, what have you, or it's coming from occupants and visitors. And pretty obviously for COVID-19, for the coronavirus, it's the occupants and visitors we're most concerned with. And then secondary comfort factors. But the point here is that this is not a sustainability issue, indoor air quality. It's a health and safety issue. So let's talk briefly about what are we talking about here. So external contaminants that can come in. Obviously, you guys are mostly familiar with this, but the main concern we have, of course, is viruses, the microbiologicals. We're not all that concerned about those things coming in through your ventilation, and we'll get into that a little bit later, why, but it's important to realize that that can happen. We are not concerned at all with your building materials in terms of the pandemic. You're not going to get the virus actually coming out of your building materials. You may get them, somebody puts them onto your building materials and then they pass that way through what's called fomite transmission. But the big one we want to talk about is the occupants. You get somebody in there who's non-symptomatic but infected, and that's the thing you want to be focused on. How do you control this? So in that context, let's think about how COVID-19 is transmitted. There's no dispute about this first one at all. Never has been. Don't expect there ever will be. The number one mechanism of transmission is heavy droplets in the air for a very short time from sneezing, coughing, talking, etc. And a lot of you maybe remember earlier on, people were advising you that you didn't have to worry. This is really mostly what you had to worry about. You still want to worry about this. The secondary source is what's called surface or fomite transmission. You know, somebody sneezes or contaminates, puts their hands down, somebody picks it up, say from an elevator switch. That's why the focus on cleaning. And by the way, although it's still important to bear this in mind, it turns out that the fomite transmission isn't nearly as bad as we thought it might have been. That doesn't mean it's not still something you need to be concerned with. You do. But the big change since the beginning is that this third mechanism are tiny droplets, or what we call aerosolized droplets or aerosols in the air, and they can hang out for a long time and spread really easily, again, from the same source as the heavy droplets, right? So this is where you think about what we were just talking about with indoor air quality. Now, this is how it transmits. It's pretty clear that the quality of the air is going to be critical for managing the risks here. So where's it most dangerous? Indoors, high density, lots of people, poorly ventilated spaces where it's dry and cool. That is a recipe for a super spreader event if you get a bunch of people in that kind of environment. So what do you want to do? Number one, and for those of you who know me, nothing new here, ventilate more. Even when we're not talking about during a pandemic, that's always a good idea. But at this point, you really want to ventilate to the extent you can. And don't just focus on air changes per hour or CFM per occupant. You want to make sure both of those are getting dealt with. And the reason is the air changes per hour is how you know that you're cycling through and filtering and getting rid of any viruses that might be in the space. The per occupant says if you have a high density space, or if you have a higher density, then you're going to make sure that you have enough fresh air going to every person. And we don't have time to dive into the exact risk factors involved in this, but you want to make sure that you get enough air for every occupant, and you can't do that based simply on air changes per hour, because if you think about it, think about a low density space with 4 air changes an hour and a high density space with 4 air changes per hour. The amount of fresh air getting to each occupant is dramatically different. Again, to reemphasize, the ASHRAE 62.1 ventilation minimums are not sufficient for a pandemic. If somebody's telling you to just meet the ASHRAE minimums, that is wrong. That is not sufficient. According to ASHRAE, that's not sufficient. And try not to accept sustainability trade-offs to save on saving energy. Understand, the financial constraints, that's something you may not be able to avoid, but absolutely do not let somebody argue that you need to be worried about CO2 gases, down the road from the energy costs of ventilating during the pandemic. For me, this is like somebody's brought into the ICU with a massive heart attack, and instead of getting their heart working again, you're going, you really need to eat more vegetables, fresh carrots. That's the ticket. Get your priorities straight. Once you ventilate, and again, to recap, ventilate to the extent you can. Don't overload your systems. Don't break your systems, please. To the extent you can, you want to filter as much as you can. And if you're in a building that has compartment fans, you want to be filtering both in the primary air handling units and in those compartment fans, MERV 13 plus, if you can, without affecting the efficiency of your system. Again, don't put so much filtration in place, which has been happening, by the way, where you end up getting way too much pressure drop, and you end up with less ventilation to get higher efficiency filtration. If you got to decide between filtration and ventilation, you should bias towards more ventilation. Ideally, you've got both, of course. And then finally, humidify to the extent you can. Be aware that if you're trying to humidify in January in downtown Calgary at 40 to 60% relative humidity, you are going to create another hazard. You're going to get moisture in your building envelope. You're going to create an environment for fungi and bacteria. And potentially you could even damage your building envelope if that moisture, basically gets out there and then freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws. So again, do what you can within reason. And it's 100,000 particles per cubic foot. That's a pretty non-dusty day. Other days it's 5 million particles per cubic foot. So that can happen in the space of a day, and it's not uncommon. Those are extremes, but they're not great extremes. It's entirely usual for us to see, let's say 80% of the readings probably fall between 200,000 and 2 million particles per cubic foot. But they're at say 0.3 microns. So if you're measuring to a particular number on a given day when you measure it, if you just happen to be having a dusty day, it's going to be misleading. You're much better to focus on how effectively are your filters working. Are they in fact filtering at MERV 13 or better, whatever your target is? And I can't get feedback from the audience right now, but if this is confusing, bring it up at the end and we can dig into it a bit. And then finally, relative humidity. We know that at this point, if you can, I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not on crack. We know how difficult that can be, but to the extent you can without hurting your building, then yeah, try and get a higher relative humidity level. We'll cut down on the viruses' ability to survive, some definition of survive.
So we do have one question, if you don't mind
please
answering. I'll just read it out. And this question's from Victor, and if he's asking, if you have a tenant who self-manages their HVAC, what would you recommend for approaching them to be increasing their ventilation CFM cycles? Minimums are good to prevent, minimums are good to present, but for over and above, is there any documentation we can back our request with?
Yeah, I would go straight to the ASHRAE pandemic guide for that one. I'd also go to Harvard Public Health. There's a guy there, what's his name? The Healthy Buildings Initiative at Harvard Public Health. It's part of the T.H. Chan Public Health Program. The guy was actually at BOMEX, was the keynote speaker. Of course, I can't think of his name now, but he's good. But their stuff is good, but ASHRAE is good. There's a whole body of literature around this, but in my experience, once you start talking about Harvard and the US EPA school studies, that seems to carry the most weight. I mean, you can send them to my stuff on the web where I'm talking about all this, but all I'm doing is pointing to the Harvard and US EPA studies. So yeah, I would absolutely start with ASHRAE, follow it up with Harvard. And if that doesn't work, there's a whole body of literature, but if they're not going to be convinced by that, it probably doesn't matter.
Kevin Delahunt just chimed in that the guy's name is Dr. Joe Allen.
That's it. Cool. And I commend him to you. I think he's a smart, well, obviously he's a smart guy. He's a Harvard PhD. But he's even smart for that. He's well worthwhile. He writes very accessible information. It's easy to understand, and he's a sensible guy. And did I mention he's a Harvard PhD? So if you got
So Victor says, thank you for a good answer.
Oh, cool. Thanks. I love this one. So one question I've been asked a few times is, should we be testing for the virus in air? And by the way, my answer is no, which may surprise some people. Now, if you're a hospital or a high-grade medical research or something, that may be that different situation. Here's the problem. Let's say we did have a test for COVID-19 in air, and there are tests for it. I'll get to the picture in a second. But we've got no agreed protocols for how to measure it. And we don't know what an action level would be. We've got no viability information. Is that really a viable virus or not? And here's a question. What are you going to do if you detect some? Pull the fire alarm, evacuate the building? It's just a mess, right? This picture is a real picture from a company called, I think, Biocontrol. And they've actually got, this is a real thing. It's not a mock-up. They're measuring the air, and see the little green, you may not be able to see it, the little green safe thing. So everybody's working their little offices, and it's measuring the air, and it's telling them that it's safe to breathe. This thing is utterly nonsensical. This is pure COVID-19 theater. This is not a good idea. Those dollars would be much better spent following the basics that everybody on this call already understands pretty well, I think. But it is kind of cool, got to admit. Okay, I want to talk about some of the other stuff out there. So if you actually look at like Fitwel in particular, has got a COVID-19 pandemic module for air quality testing. Anyhow, please be cautious with those. But if somebody's out there, or if you're thinking about your own IAQ testing during the pandemic, should you be testing for carbon dioxide? And by the way, pandemic or not, generally speaking, unless you're in a brewery generating dangerous levels of CO2, you shouldn't be testing for carbon dioxide. What you're testing for is ventilation, and you're using carbon dioxide to get that. And it's well worth pointing out, despite the the myths floating around out there, that there is no set level of carbon dioxide that will tell you that you're sufficiently ventilating. So if somebody says, well, if it's 700 ppm above background, or it's 1,000 total, or 1,100, pick your number, I've seen them all. None of those will tell you that you're sufficiently ventilating. And ASHRAE has never said it would. That's being misread. ASHRAE said up until 2019 is that you could use it at steady state. We don't have time to get into that unless you want to talk about it at the end. You can derive the ventilation rate in an occupied space by interpreting when you reach steady state from the CO2. It does not say, and it can't say because it would be wrong, that if you're below a certain level of CO2 that you're ventilating appropriately. If you're above, it's bad. If you're below, you don't know what your ventilation rate is. And I would love to talk more about that. I can talk about this for days. Anyhow, carbon monoxide. And I put the little asterisk there because I figured I'd forget to mention parkades, which is a life and death situation with carbon monoxide. But again, for IAQ testing, we're not measuring carbon monoxide because we're afraid you're going to get carbon monoxide poisoning in your offices. We're measuring it because we want to make sure that you're not pulling in bad air from your parkade or from the street level. And so carbon monoxide is a surrogate for us. So if we start seeing little bits of elevated carbon monoxide, that means you're getting a whole bunch of other bad stuff in there, and that you should try to fix. But it's not like the carbon monoxide is a hazard itself at the levels we're talking about. So again, if somebody's measuring carbon monoxide as a contaminant, full stop, that's not its purpose. And it has nothing to do with COVID-19. Volatile organic compounds, again, nothing to do with COVID-19. And most of the what's called TVOC testing, the little infrared tests, is an absolute waste of time and money. It's useless. There are specific cases where that can be useful for an investigation, but for normal IAQ testing, there's no reason to waste your money on that, and you shouldn't be doing it unless you, well, you might have to do it because you might want to meet a lead requirement or something, but it's silly. And of course, radon gas, no relation to COVID-19. You know, I don't want to discourage people from measuring IAQ, but a lot of people have constrained budgets because of the pandemic. And if your budget is constrained, I would recommend focusing much more on COVID-19 specific things, the ventilation, the filtration, the humidity, and deferring this kind of stuff. If you don't have a budgetary issue, then by all means, continue to test the proper, the complete suite. My experience right now is there's a lot of people out there with budgetary constraints on this stuff. So again, not a bad thing to measure, but if you got a limited budget, maybe focus on the thing that's killing people right now. So remember I said, tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them. So after all that, here's my quick takeaway. 3 things to try to keep your buildings air healthy during the pandemic. This is all you need to remember. Supply as much fresh air as you can without harming things. Filter that air as much as you can without, affecting the fresh air supply. And try to keep that humidity level up to 40 to 60% if that's possible, which, let's face it, it's usually not in Calgary. That's it. That's what I got.
Well, thank you, Curt. I have probably a few things, comments or questions, and perhaps Les does and some of our audience. So far away on your questions. Type in your questions, guys, and we can drill a little bit deeper into that. We're doing pretty good for time, so it should be no big deal. Um, I thought maybe I would just talk about, I think a little bit earlier, or when I was talking to you earlier the other day, I had, in our last webinar, we didn't touch on bipolar ionization, and again, you see that being promoted, by vendors. And I was just wondering what your comments on bipolar ionization were, and thoughts.
First off, promise not to sue me. Second, so this was really convenient for me because at the building show last week, the virtual building show, I was telling you guys earlier, there was some ASHRAE presentations and this came up as well. ASHRAE's position, I'm trying to quote them exactly, is that there's not sufficient data for them to make an evaluation at this point. I interpret that as they don't believe it, but they can't say that. I will say this, that in theory, it should work in certain circumstances, but it's going to be contextual. I have to say I have some data, not sufficient data, to indicate that it could be a problem when you're dealing with really large air handling systems with a lot of volume, a lot of velocity. I think it's pretty easy for it to get overwhelmed. We actually have some data on this, and it's very limited set of data, but it's not looking good for a big skyscraper in terms of its effectiveness. Now I'm specifically talking about particulates. Whether or not it's actually killing little viruses as they go through is a different question, although I don't believe it would. There wouldn't be time for that to take place. Same problem you get with infrared and the others. So I'm not saying don't do it. I would like to see more definitive data. I'd like to see some third-party double-blind studies, which I would hope we'd start seeing soon. But yeah, we can't recommend it at this point. We're not saying don't do it. We're just saying take it. It may be appropriate for your facility, but I can't really make any more general comment than that.
Yeah. Okay. So again, it may be just very or highly application specific. I would.
Yeah.
How's that? You know what I mean? So it depends.
Yeah. The other thing to be concerned with is there's one brand in particular that claims they don't generate any ozone. ASHRAE disagrees with them, says ozone and some other nasty things. We also disagree. We don't see how you can have a plasma field of that energy exposed and hitting oxygen and not generate ozone from it. This isn't me speaking. I actually took this to a physicist, a retired physicist who we do work with. And he said, yeah, it has to be generating ozone. Now, that doesn't mean it's generating dangerous levels of ozone. It doesn't mean that ozone is getting into the building. But I would be concerned personally to understand how that's not generating ozone that's getting into the space. That would be something I think the burden of proof should be on the ionization manufacturer.
Okay. I just, and this is just a very general comment, and I was on the internet the other day, and excuse me if I have her name wrong, but so there's a professor in mechanical engineering at the U of A, and I missed her talk at the ASHRAE, the Edmonton branch of ASHRAE, a few months ago, where she gave a talk. But and unfortunately, I missed that because it wasn't online. But anyway, her group of students and herself have got some kind of a grant, government grant, or however that works with the university. But anyway, so she's part of the Institute of Nanotechnology at the U of A. And anyway, she's doing a study right now about HVAC and COVID. And I don't really have a whole lot of information about exactly what her study is. Probably, you could look it up, but her name is Lexuan. That's Lexuan Zhong, Zhongeng. So again, she's a professor at mechanical engineering at the U of A, and she has three other professors that are working, and some graduate students that are working on this thing. Anyway, she's also an expert on photocatalytic. She's done a lot of research and written papers on that kind of stuff, and which is really UV PCO. But and again, it's sort of it's interesting that we have somebody homegrown, and well, not, I don't know exactly where she's from. She was educated down in Montreal somewhere, but she's definitely a Canadian, and doing some research that's kind of relevant to our times here. It just so happens, and so it'll be interesting to kind of follow and see how she. I'm assuming in the spring or whatever, that's when they'll have some results of their little study on the HVAC and particulate or the COVID virus and how it spreads. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there as kind of a homegrown thing. I haven't seen a lot of documentation about that, but I imagine if you go on the U of A website, you might find something.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
I'm aware of the group up there, and sadly I haven't been following closely, but I'm aware of them. And it looks like they're going to have some really useful information about the time we don't care anymore. Not entirely, but you know what I mean. It's well, it'd be useful information for future pandemics, because let me tell you, they're coming. Yeah, I agree. I think it is interesting, and I think that is going to be worthwhile. One of the questions that I haven't heard from this group is, are we concerned about COVID-19 spreading through the HVAC system? I sort of thought we would. And the answer to that one is generally not, but there are special cases, especially if you're familiar with the Chinese restaurant, that one where they're basically had an air conditioner and basically blown across them. And the same thing even applies in your buildings, right? That if you've got somebody sitting in the airflow from, say, a supply air vent, or sitting, right in front of a return where there's literally a path of air, then yeah, there's going to be an increased risk. But in larger buildings, larger commercial buildings, generally speaking, this stuff is going to be so diffuse that it's going to significantly minimize the chances of getting an infection. And that was the other nice thing about that we know now, we didn't know in the spring, is that it does look like it takes quite a bit of COVID-19. Well, COVID-19's you're not going to get quite a bit of the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, to actually break through your defenses. So, basically people who are getting sick from long-term exposures at fairly high levels. It's typically not going to get through, from a very minor. Obviously, there's going to be exceptions to that. And it's also interesting that it looks like the less exposure you have, even if you do get sick, the less ill you're becoming. And I don't know that I understand that, by the way. I find that really interesting. But the notion that it's exposure time times exposure quantity, pretty traditional approach for this stuff. So again, if you're talking about a downtown skyscraper and the volume of air and the stuff flowing through there, I wouldn't be too concerned. If you're talking about someone in a little strip mall, older strip mall or something with some limited ventilation, I'd be a little more concerned. But as a general rule, more ventilation is better.
Yeah, and I want to just sort of bring it up is that ventilation is very key with it all, and we want to make sure that what we're doing is genuine. And I mean that by is, the root person is to say, well, I want to, I'm ventilating, but making sure that you are ventilating, making sure that the dampers are well open. A lot of the operators are looking at these buildings and they believe they're computers, and computers are liars, and they say, well, my dampers are open 100%. But if you go out into the field and you'll see that the damper is not 100%, it could be 50% or it could be closed. The fan, just because it say it's running, it could be the belts are slipping and you're not getting 100%. And also when you're testing for it as well, making sure the equipment that you're testing with has been calibrated and is genuine, making sure that if you're testing for oxygen content or carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide, that the equipment isn't bought at the corner store for 15 or 20 or $100, but to bring in experts and validate what you're doing. Like you said, Curt, is you're going to be held responsible for that higher standard, and that every once in a while you want to make sure that what you're delivering to the customer, to the tenant, is in fact true, that your dampers are working, that the gaskets around your filters are nice and tight, that you're running through the MERV 13 filters and making sure that it is passing through those filters, not around the outside of it. Just like when if and making sure that the testing results, making sure that if the fan data is true, go out into the field and making sure that it is true, that it is important to test. If you're going to be testing for oxygen, yeah, you can test it, but also it's a good idea to bring in an expert and just validate it and record it and log it as well. Because if you don't log it, then the government comes in, because what's going to happen is the litigators are going to show up. Somebody's going to get COVID at the building site, and they're going to go and they're going to get a hold of a lawyer, and they're going to say, well, you didn't deliver to me fresh air. The fellow made popcorn and it smelt like popcorn for the last 2 hours. I know you're not delivering the right air. So you may have to defend it. And so make sure that you record it, you log it, you test it, you validate it with experts to make sure that it is running and it is correct. Humidity, you're right. You run our humidity. We want to run it as high as possible without causing, funguses or bacteria growing along the windows, keeping it validated and running as well. So maybe it is looking at budgeting purposes, go with steam or humidification, making sure that what we're running and testing for is accurate. You say, well, the computer says it's running at a 30%, but go out there and test it, making sure it is 30%, not 15% or 2%. It's good to back up what you're doing and making sure that the building operator, who really is the last line of defense, is making sure that the systems are running as intended.
To add to that, Les?
Yes, of course.
It's funny you should mention this because, and again, a building that shall remain nameless for a company that shall remain nameless, a pretty high prestige building in downtown Calgary, they sent me some CO2 results because we were thinking we could, back up some of the more sophisticated testing we do with their existing CO2. Funny thing is, they've got a lot of readings in there where the CO2 is reading about 225 to 250 parts per million. And if anybody who's listening doesn't know why Les is laughing, it's because the background levels of CO2 right now are kicking around 400 in Calgary.
Yeah, exactly.
So I asked, I just took a glance and went, well, these numbers are wrong. When did you calibrate these things last? And the answer was, when the building was built.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
And this is, I know there's a lot of buildings out there that are monitoring CO2, but from what I'm seeing, they're not getting calibrated.
Yeah.
And a bad number is a bad number. So you don't have to go crazy on this, and maybe you don't have to go to Honeywell or Siemens or whoever and say, come in and calibrate every single one, but you should be running some sort of QA to catch that before it gets that bad. Because this wasn't just one, this was a whole swack of them. So they were drifting in tandem, obviously.
Yeah.
Don't do that, please. The other, by the way, and this is related as well, you know, the machines monitoring stuff. This was a different building a few years back, and we actually were measuring CO specifically, as I was talking before, where, you know, we're looking at numbers of less than 1, 2 parts per million. And I couldn't believe it. I got a number and it was like 30 some, which is above the occupational exposure limit. And it's like, holy moly. You know, my first thought was my instrument failed. No, it didn't. And so we went and took a look at the building management, you know, the building information system, and they pulled up the records. And sure enough, they'd been monitoring on their CO detectors. And yeah, our numbers matched. So they were calibrated. But apparently nobody thought it was worth mentioning to anybody that they had carbon monoxide coming into their building above the occupational exposure limit.
Yeah, holy smokes. I mean, that's
fun, guys.
Well, again, you know, what you were referring to on ventilation rates, you know, the numbers out there between 6 and 12 changes. I guess 6 would be the minimum, or I seem to remember that number from, you know, years ago. But 12, so how would the average building operator know what his ventilation rate is?
That's actually why I mentioned you should have a mechanical engineer. I mean, I assume you have mechanical engineers. They should know that. That's part of the design specification for that building. So you should at least know what it's supposed to be and what it should be capable of doing. You know, measuring what it's actually doing is a second. Those are two sides of the same coin. But yeah, especially with newer buildings, you can't get 30 CFM per occupant out of those things. They weren't engineered to be able to handle it. The older buildings can actually handle it better. But yeah, you need to go to your mechanical engineer, and you need the mechanical engineer to tell you this is the capacity of this system. This is what it's designed for. This is what it can do in theory, and then work within that context, and then test to make sure it's actually doing that.
Yeah, I agreed very much so that you need to be validated, and you need we talk about recommissioning of buildings, making sure that how things are running are still being run as an original intent, and then confirming that on a regular basis, making sure that the valves are opening and closing at the right amounts, that the dampers are doing the same thing, making sure that everything is running as per spec.
Yeah, it's the overall thing that matters. It's don't get hung up on the little details, but you got to make sure that the physical plant itself is standing on its feet, and that goes for all the things that we've been talking about. Yes, the details do matter, and the big picture matters, and sometimes you got to stand back and think about, you know, what that big picture is. Every building is maybe a little bit different, or groups of buildings, but it's all the same science. So
the principles don't change, but every building is different. Exactly.
So we don't have any more questions from the field here, unless somebody feels the need to type in something. I guess we're running on well, we've done all right. It's just shortly after 6, so I think your talk is appropriate and relevant, and certainly I appreciate your time and your candor, and looking forward to maybe, you know, oh, there's somebody just popped up with a question. There you go. And it's Victor again. He's just saying great information. Thanks again. So there you go. So cheers, Curt, and hopefully you'll follow along with us and throughout time here. And who knows, maybe we might have to talk about some of the stuff again and again to try to reinforce it, or as new information becomes available. So
Absolutely.
yeah, and Kyle just said great presentation. Sorry I didn't have any more questions. Great job.
It was good and self-explanatory, and if I can touch base with a little bit, I want to say thanks, Curt, for making a presentation that didn't dwell on a lot of questions because you answered them, the questions in your talk. So that was awesome. One of the things is that we're going to be having next month is Ernest Leahy from Service Master is going to be talking about cleaning the facilities that we work in and making sure that the tenants that are feeling safe, even though you were not, the exposure isn't going to be large of the coronavirus, but we want to make sure that the people are comfortable sitting in their offices, those people that are essential services, and making sure that we're cleaning them and knowing how they are cleaned, dealing with that in the coronavirus atmosphere. So that'll be January the 12th. Also, we've been sending out our dues to the building operator members. Please pay them. We're as poor as church mice. As a matter of fact, church mice think we're poor, so that's how broke we are. But that's always a case for us not-profit organizations. It's all about the education. And Curt, you've educated us well on this, so thank you very much for the time and effort that you put into it.
Okay, well, I guess if nobody has anything else, we're good.
We are.
Good job, Les.
Good. You too. Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Goodbye, everybody.
Toodaloo.
Stay safe,
Stay safe.
everyone.
Stay safe
Christmas is coming, so don't forget to smile.
and be kind to one another.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank
There
you.
you go.
Right.
Cheers.
Cheers.